Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking about the first house in astrology and what it means, and looking at some example charts of first house placements involving planets in the first house, the ruler of the first house, or even transits through the first house in order to get a sense for what the first house actually means and what it's all about. And I'm recording it today with a live audience of patrons of the Astrology Podcast who signed up to support me through my work, through my page on Patreon. And we're going to do a mixture of, I put out a call for examples of first house placements, both publicly in terms of like Twitter and Facebook, and also privately in terms of different patrons. And today, since I have a live audience of patrons, I'm going to be hopefully bringing a few of them on to talk about their first house placements, if they have a striking example. And then I'm also going to be reading and sharing some different examples that were sent in by people online. All right. So, first things first, let's start with some preliminary stuff about the first house and what it means. So, here is a diagram which shows the significations of each of the 12 houses. So there's only so many significations I can really fit on here because I could only fit like three or four core significations. So the four core significations for the first house that I have is that it represents the self, the body, the character, and the person's appearance. So the first house is in whole sign houses, it's the rising sign. So it's the sign that was rising up over the eastern horizon at the moment that you were born. So this is the sign that's the most personally relevant to you as the individual who was born at that moment. And there's different houses in the chart that represent different people in our life or different areas of our life. But the first house is really the primary house that relates to you because the rising sign and the degree of the ascendant, which is where the sun rises up over the eastern horizon each morning, but especially the morning that you were born. And just in the same way that the sun and the other planets and stars rise up over the eastern horizon each day and are born as they emerge from under the earth and move up into the sky and become visible, in the same way, each of us was born at a specific moment in time. And at that time, we sort of like emerged into the world, and our body emerged into the physical world as separate from the body of our mother. So that's part of the symbolism with the first house. And that's part of the reason why it's so intimately connected to you as the person who was born at that moment, because of that same symbolism of the planets emerging over the eastern horizon at the rising sign um, at the same moment as you were born. So the first house, as a result of that, is the primary house in the chart that represents you and your sense of self and who you are. And sometimes that's kind of an abstract signification that doesn't make a lot of sense until you have like a first house transit, or you have eclipses going through your first house or something like that. And then all of a sudden, your sense of self and your sense of who you are becomes much more distinct as like a factor in your life that you're focused on and that you're reflecting on when you're thinking about, who am I? Like, what am I doing here in the world? And how am I showing up in the world to other people? Because the first house is also the house that represents the body and the physical incarnation of the native, in addition to their character, or in ancient astrology, the spirit of the native. So it has, because in whole sign houses, part of the first house is below the horizon under the earth, and which represents the physical body. And the other part of the house is above the horizon in the sky, which represents the spirit or the psyche or the character of the individual. And of course, in the first house, those two realms are coming together so that you get this blending of both the spirit as well as the body of the individual. So some of the things that come up when it comes to the first house is um, your body, your health, but also your physical vitality. So sometimes there can be natal placements in the first house, and sometimes there can be certain people that just have good health naturally, or who have a strong physical constitution, or who don't get sick regularly, or in some instances who where there's something particularly striking about their body and their physical incarnation that's beneficial or that's helpful to them that arises somehow naturally. So sometimes you'll see this, for example, if somebody has um, positive first house placements, and if they're particularly like physically attractive for some reason, or if there's something distinctive about their appearance. And in some instances, they're able to leverage that in order to bring about good things in their life. Like, for example, let's say somebody who was a model, or somebody who's able to use their physical appearance to their advantage in some way. So that's one scenario. Other scenarios in terms of the first house and the physical body is that sometimes, because it represents our physical health and constitution, if there's challenging placements with the first house, sometimes there can be health issues. So this can be the scenario where sometimes with these difficult placements, a person can have, let's say, either accidents or injuries that cause physical harm to the body, or in some instances, it can be issues with illness or issues with sickness or something like that that are hard to deal with when it comes to the body, so that the person is having to focus on their health and having to focus on taking care of themselves, or on counteracting the negative impacts of some health issue more regularly. So that's something that we'll see and that will come up in some of our chart examples as we start going through and talking about things. If anybody has any specific examples of either of those two scenarios, please let me know in the comments or in the Q&A section, and maybe I can share that as an example. All right, so sometimes those can be natal placements, but other times we can be talking about transits, which can indicate like the onset of something, either a good health period or a period where you're focused on your body and your physical health more, or in other instances, a difficult period where something negative or challenging comes up that you're forced to deal with or forced to wrestle with. Um, So that's definitely a scenario that comes up that we all experience at some point in our life, whether we have a natural predisposition to having positive health placements or challenging health placements. All of us will eventually have some positive health placements or transits go through the first house, and all of us will have some challenging health placements go through the first house, and we'll experience the other side of that, even if we don't have a natural predisposition for it, because everybody eventually gets sick. Everyone eventually, gets health issues or injuries at some point in their life when a difficult transit happens. And on the flip side of that, everybody also eventually goes through some period where they're feeling better vitality, where they're feeling good about living in their body for a period of time, or in which case, sometimes when a person is dealing with health issues, sometimes they'll meet a doctor or they'll find a new way to fix that issue or to offset it. And sometimes that can be represented by positive transits going through the first house when something difficult is being mitigated or is being addressed in some way. So that can be also important to pay attention to. So in the live chat, Dawn says, I had a first house profection year involving a first house Mars and transiting Mars, and I had surgery for a malignant tumor. So that's a really good example, both because there's both a natal placement there as well as a transiting placement, and having both of those get activated in some way, and then having a health issue arise. So there was another person, I think on Twitter, who said that they had like 6 or 7 surgeries or something like that, and they had Mars in the first house in a day chart. So sometimes surgeries can definitely be a Mars related thing, just because Mars involves cutting or severing. And sometimes, though, that cutting or severing can be necessary if it's a surgery in order to fix something that's gone wrong. But nonetheless, it's still getting represented by Mars in some way because it represents literally a sort of cutting into the body in order to attempt to fix something. So I might come back around to that example. Let me actually check those examples and see if I can find that one. So this one came in from Twitter where I put out a call for examples. And this is a person named Snare on Twitter. They said, I have a Libra Mars in the first house. I've had 4 major surgeries and at least 3 minor ones. I had my first 2 major surgeries when I was 19. That was a Venus ruled year that activated my Mars. So, and in the chart itself, we can see that they have Libra rising and Mars in Libra in the first house in a day chart. So, in that instance, it's manifested literally in having to have a bunch of different surgeries as something that's kind of distinctive about the life. And I asked what the surgeries were for, and they said they were for a C-section, several cystectomies, laparoscopies, oophorectomy, lumpectomy, and a coronectomy. So that's a really good example just because there's some people that never have like a single surgery in their life, let's say in one extreme scenario, versus there might be somebody else who has comparatively a lot of surgeries where there have been a lot of instances where their body needs to be like cut into for some reason. And this would be one of those instances where Mars, the planet of severing and separation, is in the first house, which is the house that has to do with the physical body. And sometimes it can be as literal as that. But that also opens it up because then we can take from that a broader point about Mars indicating severing and separation and how that might manifest in literal ways if you put it in other houses in the chart. Like in the second house, it could be a severing or separation that has to do with the person's money or finances. In the fourth house, it might have to do with the person's parents or living situation. In the seventh house, it might have to do with relationships, or in the 10th house, it might have to do with their career. So that's one of the things we're going to be doing in this series, and that I try to do for the most part in my approach to astrology is sometimes look at things very simply and very literally in order to understand what the symbolism is. So that doesn't mean that the placements can't also relate more broadly to things relating to a person's like character or psyche or how they go about acting in the world or other things like that. But it means that we have to be open to and we have to try to identify on the most core fundamental level what is the most literal way that this symbolism can manifest in a person's life as well at the same time. So Aaron in the live chat says that chart looks similar to mine in many ways. I've had a few surgeries myself, also kind of hilarious to track Mars transits to my ascendant degree. The last time I started a new series of allergy shots, the last time I cut my hand pretty severely chopping veggies, and the time before I caught an electric shock while replacing the smoke detectors in my home that almost knocked me off the ladder. That's a really good example. Um, so let's do that one. That might be a good example if you feel like sharing it, Aaron. Do you want to join me just to share your chart for a moment?
Yeah,
Hey, thanks for joining me.
definitely. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, so here's your chart, and for those listening to the audio version, so we have a chart with 2 degrees of Libra rising. Mars is at 25 degrees of Libra in the first house. It's conjunct Pluto at 19 degrees of Libra. And this is a day chart with the Sun in Leo in the 11th whole sign house. And the ruler of the ascendant is Venus, which is at 13 degrees of Cancer in the 10th house. So you said, how is that Mars placement manifested for you in literal ways? You said you've had some like accidents and injuries over the past several years when that becomes activated.
Yeah, that's yeah, there's lots of ways, but that's one thing that I found, yeah, pretty funny to track is Mars going over my ascendant degree. I noticed pretty early on in my astrology studies, I think it was the time that I basically electrocuted myself on the ladder. I was like, oh my gosh, that's not good when Mars goes over my ascendant for me. Um,
So Mars conjoined your ascendant and then you like seriously electrocuted yourself?
Yeah, I mean, non-fatal, obviously, because I'm still here. But yeah, I caught a good shock. I thought I had turned off. I thought I had flipped the breaker. I flipped the breaker for the room that I was working in, but
Hmm.
apparently all the smoke detectors are on their own separate breaker, which I didn't realize at the time. So that's
Uh,
how I learned that. Yeah, and then the next time I cut my hands pretty badly chopping vegetables, and I think it was like the day after Mars had like conjoined my ascendant exactly. So it was like moving away. I don't know. I guess I thought I was okay with a knife. I wasn't. Um, and then this last time, really the most constructive.
how badly
Um,
did you cut yourself? Were you like bleeding?
oh yeah, I should have probably gone and got stitches or glue. I didn't because it was like a
Hmm.
Sunday and I didn't want to go to the ER and I didn't want to pay for that. So I mean, I get that's probably part of being a Mars Pluto person too. I'm a survivor. I'm just like bandaged up,
Right.
kept
And just,
chopping my veg.
and
Yeah,
just power through.
power through it. That's
Nice.
exactly right.
Ar-
And then yeah, I've had allergies my entire life, and I was just thinking about the first time I did allergy shots. I was like, I started at 11, and I'm sure it went. You know, we did it for like a couple of years, so it definitely went through a first house perfection for me. Um, and more recently, I realized like where I'm living is probably just not the best choice for me, but I also don't have an option to move right now. So I'm just really allergic to where I'm living. So I'm doing more allergy shots. And that was the last time that Mars went over my ascendant, like to the day, was just happened to be. I didn't plan it that way. But that happened to be the date for my first shot for this series of allergy shots that I'm doing now.
So then you said you first developed those allergies or realized you had them when you were 11?
Well, I think I knew, or my parents knew to some extent, basically my whole life, that I had quite a few allergies, food and environmental. But yeah, I had a bout when I was 11 where I like broke out in full body hives, couldn't keep anything in my stomach. And that's like when I ended up actually allergist.
Got it. So it was like a physical reaction all over your skin of like irritation.
Yeah, it was a really severe reaction. Like I was bright red everywhere, basically. Everywhere was inflamed, itching, yeah, and inside my stomach too, apparently, because I just couldn't even keep it any. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
redness and inflammation are two really core Mars terms that we'll see come up a lot, like over and over again for different people when it comes to its placement, like anywhere in the chart, just importing those qualities. Um, so you started having to get shots, and what is involved in that, or why is it a shot? Because I know like some people for allergies, it's like they take some Benadryl and that's it. But what's the shot? What's with that?
Yeah, I take Benadryl every day.
Okay.
Like basically, the shots are supposed to get your because allergies basically what it is your immune system freaking out at dust, pollen, being like, oh my gosh, we're being invaded when actually it's fine. So it's like you're reacting to yourself, which I think is a very Mars and detriment in the first. And the shots are supposed to basically desensitize you to the allergens. So, like, the more you're exposed to it, hopefully, the less you'll react to it in the wild, is the idea. But yeah, injections and needles and puncturing, of course, is how you go about it. And like right now, I'm getting 4 shots a week. So I go in and I get 2 in one arm and 2 in the other. And like, yeah, I just have bruises most of the time on my arms. And this is just like my life now. And I'm like, wow, that's really appropriate for Mars in Libra in the first, I think.
Yeah, just
And
getting shots and having like a piercing of the body is also just very fitting in terms of the symbolism as well.
yeah. And I mean it, and that's funny that you say that because like I've had a lot of piercings in my life. That's just something that I enjoyed doing in my younger years. Um, and I also danced for a really long time from the ages of 3 to 18 and really kind of messed up my ankles through doing that. So I think that's pretty appropriate for Mars and Libra in the first too. Um, and then more recently, I sustained a pretty serious head injury. And I was thinking about that and I was like, that's Mars in the first stuff too, isn't it? So yeah, I have to be careful with my um, health because I feel like I am sort of prone to uh, that sort of thing. And then there's a lot of other expressions of what it, how it's expressed itself in my life and my relationships, being the ruler of the seventh as well.
Yeah, I was actually going
As
to ask
part of this
that. I mean, it might be
aspect.
if that is like a good example. I was just curious because since Mars is ruling the seventh house of relationships and it's also ruling the second house of finances and it's in your first house of self, I was curious how that manifested and if that manifested in some literal way.
It totally has. Um, and I'm fine with talking about it. I feel like my life is a bit of a trigger warning, so maybe I should put that out there. But yeah, I grew up in a household where my parents had a dysfunctional relationship dynamic themselves. It was pretty codependent, and there was some abuse going on. And so basically, I learned that same relationship dynamic. I think you see this maybe some too with Mars overcoming the moon in the
Hmm.
fourth house, which is also in detriment there. And I experienced my father, especially, is very controlling, which I think you see that with that Pluto. Um, and as I grew older, I found myself falling into the same relationship dynamics with men, and there was domestic violence, which thankfully I got out of. And it's funny because I like get in these situations, but I always survive them. And I guess I credit that to my strong Venus in the 10th. Maybe that Mars is conjunct Spica also is helpful. I'm not sure, but I always like seem to survive them and get out of them somehow. But Pluto actually squaring my Mars like brought a lot of change and healing, I would say, to my relationship dynamics. So I feel to some extent, at least on the other side of that, but it's definitely played out, in every way that you would probably guess by looking at that.
Got it. Yeah.
It's complicated. And my relationship, I think, with the masculine in general has been complicated throughout my life because of my relationship with dad. Um, and it's funny because like I look the most like my dad of my two parents, and so then there's like the whole self and other thing. It's like I look like him but I don't want to be like him, and just the complicated nature of a planet in detriment, especially out of
That
sect malefic in the
that's
first.
brilliant. Yeah, like how do you deal with looking like the person that you don't necessarily want to look like and how you reflect on that in terms of your sense of self and like who you are?
Right. Yeah,
That's really
exactly.
interesting. What are some of the to balance things out? Like, what are some of the positive things from your Mars placement? It sounds like when you were younger that you were very like physically active, and I know Mars in the first house can be sometimes people that are very physically have a lot of vitality or energy in some instances. I also noticed that Mars is like very closely sextile your Mercury. So you probably have a more like direct manner of communication, which is also something that sometimes people with Mars in the first house have in general. I'm not sure how Libra's offsetting it, but
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm like sort of a ballsy Venusian, I guess, in a way. And yeah, that really tight Mercury Mars sextile. I think I'm very difficult to win an argument against. Um, growing up, my dad was always like, "You need to be a lawyer because you're impossible to argue with." Like, yes, no. Um, and so there's that. And yeah, I do have a lot of energy. I find I have a tremendous amount of energy. I did actually basically go too hard and burn myself out in like 2017. Basically, suffer from adrenal fatigue and have to recover from that. So that was a good lesson learned for me. But that said, like I do have a lot of energy, and I find I have a lot of willpower when I really put my mind to something. Like it's gonna happen. It's going to happen. Like that's just sort of the way I am, and I think I've taken that for granted a lot in my life, and less so now. I now recognize sort of how unique that is, um, and in I don't I guess I dance some for fun, but I've recently taken up like more sporty things like kickboxing and weightlifting, which I didn't really think that I would like before, but found that I really love. It makes me feel amazing afterwards, and I think it's an incredible outlet for Mars. So I think that
Totally.
it burned me a lot more before I really realized or learned. I'm in my 40s now, so I mean I've had a lot of time to build experience in how to work and how to make it work for me, I guess, as best as I can. It's interesting. I haven't had near like the problems with money that I have with relationships. That seems to go better in my life, but I'm very independent of my finances. Like I've never had a joint bank account with anyone, even
Hmm.
when I was married. I'm just like, no, my money's my money and yours is yours. So that's probably helped me, I would guess, like not get in situations where money becomes a real problem. But
Yeah, that's kind of
yeah.
interesting with Uranus there at the same time, and there's like this like independent streak to how you deal with finances, which is something that Mars and Uranus can share to some extent.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I guess that's what it is, isn't it?
Nice. Well, that's a great example, and I really like that your point about like channeling it into those sporty or athletic type things, especially recently. And that seems like good advice for everybody, like whatever their placement is, to find ways that are symbolically similar to that placement that are like constructive manifestations of it. And I think when a person does that, it can be really useful for like letting off steam sort of in an area of the chart where otherwise you might have a lot of energy building up, and it could be like having too much steam or too much energy. But sometimes when you give it an outlet, um, that can like creatively express something that could otherwise be a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. I think Mars Pluto especially can be, there are good things about it. I think we're kind of hard to kill, and like we have a lot of energy and have a lot of stores of energy, but it can be explosive. So yeah, I think having like a pressure release valve is sort of the key. That's what I think.
Totally. All right. Awesome. This is a great example. Thank you so much for sharing this. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. That was a great example. Does anybody have an example like that with, let's say, benefic placement or other first house placements that might be relevant? Let me know in the comments, because I'm following the live chat right now. So this was sent in by Janae Anthony on Twitter, who said, I have Mars in Leo conjunct the Ascendant. At about age 11 was the onset of my chronic uveitis, inflammation of the eyes. Over the years, the inflammation led to scar tissue developing, and it's this scarring that led to my loss of vision. Very diurnal Mars conjunct the Ascendant. Also, was when I was in my first house year, in my when I was in my first house year, I had a very stressful last minute move at the same time that I was starting grad school. Mars as the ruler of the fourth house and the ninth house in the first. So, and here's the chart. So, Janae has 14 Leo rising, and Mars is at 20 degrees of Leo in the first house in a day chart. So, this is a good example. And Janae, I believe Janae is actually recently became the new president of the Association for Young Astrologers, which is actually really awesome. And, or the new chair of the Association for Young Astrologers. And Janae, I think Janae's legally blind. So this was a good example, again, of like a first house inflammation type scenario that's connected to the body. And there may be like different ways that you can narrow down the area or the body parts or different things like that. But just generally speaking, it's a good example because again, it shows different ways that Mars and that tendency to symbolically bring like heat or inflammation or other things like that can manifest sometimes in very literal ways. So there's other things that are like relevant about that um, that maybe I can talk to Janae about later at some point. But so that's like one aspect of things that we have to pay attention to with the first house is just the physicality of the body, and that sometimes challenging placements or transits can indicate that a person struggles with, or that there are things that a person has to deal with that relate to the physical body that are maybe like not preferable or not things that they would like to deal with. But nonetheless, that's the area of life where they have some challenges or some struggles. And it's good to be aware of the full range of possible manifestations and the full spectrum when it comes to that, both in terms of positive things as well as challenging things. So, in terms of positive placements, um, in my some of this is reminding me that I had two friends. I had two friends when I was younger when I first started studying astrology, and they were born relatively close apart, and both of them had Scorpio rising, and both of them had Mars and Saturn in Scorpio in the first whole sign house. But one of them had a day chart and one of them had a night chart. And the one with the day chart was constantly like bumping into things and getting small injuries or small cuts and like getting little accidents and Mars related things like that. Whereas the other one with the night chart, um, so that Saturn was more difficult, they were anemic. They struggled with like Saturn related ailments of like being too cold or like being slowing down, and eventually dealt with cancer, which is more of a Saturn type sort of ailment as well at the same time. So sometimes first house planets and other things can relate to the physical types of challenges that can arise in a person's life in a very literal way. All right, let me see some of the other comments that have come in. So Maggie said they had an example that involved hives. Okay, that's good. Alyssa said gave birth to my son in a first house year and a Jupiter return. That can definitely be like a big like body related change that would make sense when it comes to the first house. Carly says, wow, at age 11, 12th house perfection year and eye inflammation. The unseen, very literal. Okay. Samantha says, can Mars represent movement? I have Mars in the first, and my parents divorced when I was young, so I was back and forth a lot, studied abroad and toured the country for 5 summers. Yeah, potentially. I mean, especially the separation of the parents sometimes when you have planets in the first or the seventh, especially because one of the things that happens is that planets in the first, especially if they're closely conjunct the ascendant, that automatically means that they're opposing the degree of the descendant, which can sometimes bring in seventh house things at the same time. That's also true of the fourth house and the 10th house, that sometimes planets in the first house, if there's planets in the fourth or the 10th, they can be closely aspected by the first house planets. So sometimes it can be indicating issues that are arising in connection with those houses. So Jeannie says, I have a condition of the skin that's completely in my first house in my chart. I have Saturn and Uranus in the first house in Sagittarius. The condition is so weird that doctors can't even pronounce it. Very Uranian in nature, and Saturn ruling the skin and a boundary between our insides and the outside worlds. It's called hydration dentus superativa is the closest I can get to pronouncing that. That's really interesting. Yeah, that brings up a good point about Uranus, that sometimes when Uranus is in the first house, there's something unique or something weird or something out of the ordinary about either our body and physical constitution, or something. Sometimes it's something about our character, because that's the other thing we have to remember is even though we're talking about physical first house placements and like ailments to the body with the first house is also the primary house that relates to a person's character and psyche. And sometimes placements in the first house can manifest through the psychology of the native and the way that they approach the world and the way that they approach other people in the world. So sometimes like Uranus in the first house, it can be something about the way the person acts. Although in this instance, this is a like a literal manifestation again. So Megan says Jupiter just passed over my ascendant sun conjunction. I gained weight like almost overnight. Yeah, there was a few people that mentioned that. There was another person that mentioned Jupiter going through their first house, and they said that well, there's some that said they gained a lot of weight, and then there's other people that had Saturn go through their first house, and one of them said that they lost 30 pounds. So the body and like especially weight and things related to weight, either like gaining weight or losing weight can be represented by either placements in the first house or first house transits, especially since all of us go through like different weight fluctuations at different points in our life, although there can be different reasons that we have like wild weight fluctuations. Especially, for example, sometimes Saturn going through the first can be like getting sick or something and losing weight as a result of that. Um, so that's a very common manifestation of first house transits that are commonly mentioned. And sometimes you can use that for rectification purposes if you're trying to narrow down a person's rising sign is look at a period recently if Saturn went through the first house and ask not just about potential like health issues during that time, but also about like did you lose weight for some reason during that time, during that 2 to 3 year period? And sometimes if the answer is yes, it means that Saturn was transiting through their first house at that time. Okay. I mean, that's a pretty good positive one. Brenda says Jupiter on Regulus about 5 degrees from my ascendant degree. Am an optimistic, hopeful, and helpful person. Have been told that I'm inspirational. I also like food and have to be careful not to overeat. Do you feel like sharing that example and just talking for maybe a few minutes, Brenda? Hey,
Hi,
thanks for joining me.
thank you.
What's your birth data?
6/13/68.
All right. Is your ascendant 24 Leo?
It is.
Cool. All right. Here's your chart. So you have 24 Leo rising. You have Jupiter at 29 degrees of Leo, and you have the sun in Gemini in the 11th whole sign house, conjunct Mars. I mean, your chart's actually funny because it reminds me of like another one that has similar but like kind of inverted placements, which is yeah, which is Trump's chart basically. It was lately arising with like Mars conjunct the ascendant, which characterizes, his personality, but you have a very different manifestation of that. You have Leo rising with Jupiter conjunct the ascendant. So you said that people described you in what way again?
Inspirational. I'm a physical therapist, so I'm always helping people with their physical ailments and also just with my life experiences, just kind of coming from a challenging situation and always kind of finding the light to follow and the path out of some negative situation, whether it's my own or someone else's. Just always looking for the hope.
So that notion of like hope or optimism is just like a core part of your personality, and it's something that you kind of like radiate outward onto others.
Yeah, yeah. Before I knew anything about astrology, I was known for saying, if you have hope, you have everything. And so
Hmm.
just kind of feeling like that's the answer to almost any situation is just feeling like you can change it. And tomorrow's another day and it'll get better. And yeah.
I love that. Where does that come from, or at what point did that start in terms of your early life?
I think I've just always had that feeling about life in general, but I did have a challenging childhood, and I think on paper or from an external sort of viewpoint, people might have thought that I might not succeed. And in fact, I have a doctoral degree, I have my own business, I'm doing quite well, but there were times in my life where it didn't look so positive, and but I just always knew that it would be okay, and yeah, I just kept moving forward.
How did you get into physical therapy and like helping people in terms of that?
Yeah, I knew I always wanted to be helpful, just innately wanted to do that. And I knew medicine was a good way to do it. Um, but I really like helping people to help themselves. And so instead of being kind of a passive medical practitioner, I wanted to do something where I was actively engaging and helping people to learn how to help themselves. And so physical therapy is perfect for that. I'm also a pretty physical person, and so I like activity. And so I just liked taking knowledge, applying it to the body, and doing it in a non-invasive sort of way, with an empowering sort of mindset behind it all.
That makes
Um,
sense. And that's actually your optimism or instilling hope. That's actually necessary in physical therapy because you have to do a lot of like encouraging and like trying to give people the internal like motivation to do something that's hard physically.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're taking someone that's painful and scared, and you're showing them, how to change that and how to move away from that situation into, a fully functional, happy, sort of physically active lifestyle again, reclaiming function. So yeah, just it fits perfectly. It's like hand in glove. It's the perfect profession for me. And I get to do it daily. I just get to have that same moment over and over and over again where I reach out and I take someone that's in a challenge situation and I help them. So it's a beautiful expression of, I guess, my soul's purpose. I don't know, but yeah, I love it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. How has your physical health been?
Good. Yeah. I mean, I do. I do think this ties in. So you see that Jupiter rules my eighth house, and I was diagnosed with melanoma several
Hmm.
years ago during an eighth house perfection year. So, Jupiter with that growth, I think that might have been a reflection. And then it rules my fifth house, and I am very fertile. I can have lots of children. So, yeah. And then I do have good luck with partners' money. It shows up in other places too in my chart where Jupiter is.
Right. With the melanoma, you caught it early though, so that it didn't develop.
Exactly. It was actually my husband that caught it, and yeah, it was quick, and it's a thing of the past. It's been several years. I think it was 2013 or 14 or something like that that I caught it, and it was still stage one. So yeah, but
Okay.
yeah, that sort of unchecked growth that maybe Jupiter could be known for, and Jupiter ruling that eighth house of death.
Yeah, that was something that came up also in the Jupiter and Taurus episode when there were some people that were having like first house transits where sometimes something bad was coming up health-wise, but then they were able to catch it early enough or they were able to get medical treatment for it so that it became something that they were able to survive and like heal from, as opposed to, let's say, like the worst case scenarios. Like imagine that you don't catch something until it's too late, or you're not able to get help with it for some reason. Whereas this is like the opposite scenario, like imagining, in your case, a scenario where somebody is actually kind of fortunate that when something potentially life-threatening did come up, with it being the ruler of the eighth house, that you were actually able to catch it early enough that it wasn't able to grow and turn into something that actually like shortened your life.
Absolutely. And my husband also has Jupiter in his first house, and he's the one that found it for me. So I don't know if there's some synastry sort of Jupiter help, but definitely um, I'm all good.
What's his rising sign?
He's a Libra rising.
Okay, just curious. Does he share the same like sense of optimism that you have?
Yeah, yeah, he totally does. In fact, I think he might even be more optimistic. Our children always laugh about both of our optimism. One example is he just always completely over or underestimates how long it'll take to get somewhere in the car. So he'll say we'll be in the car for a few hours. It'll be something more like five. So the kids just know to take it with a grain of salt because dad's always going to be overly optimistic about about that.
Right, that's really funny. That's brilliant. I'm trying to think of any other questions, but that's a great example, because it's describing like physical things it's also describing like what you ended up doing for work to some extent, but then also describing your demeanor and like your character to some extent as well is very much encapsulated by that placement. So you really get all of the different layers of the first house.
Yeah, I feel really lucky and grateful that I got that. I mean, there's lots of other things in my chart that aren't so great, but thank God I have Jupiter there.
Sure. Yeah. Like everybody has some area where they have challenges and some area where they're just kind of lucky. And I'm glad you use that term lucky because I think that's a good way sometimes to frame it in terms of fortune and like chance. And sometimes there's things that are outside of our control that it can go either way. But sometimes being able to like see and acknowledge those areas can be really important. And sometimes with the first house, though, it's also nice that you have a awareness of that because otherwise it's like sometimes people tend to take for granted the things that are good in their life, or sometimes when the good thing is something that's arising from within you that you're actually doing or putting out there into the world, you don't always necessarily recognize that as a positive thing. But in your instance, it's like really clear that you do and really clear that that is like a beneficial thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to acknowledge the beautiful things in life as well as the challenging things in life and, really hold on to those things. Everything changes and sometimes we have those wonderful moments and embrace them and cherish them, but recognize that, there'll be negative moments too, but that too will pass. So yeah, embrace it all.
Yeah. So last two questions. How many children do you have with that
I
ruling
have
your fifth house?
three. I have three, and they actually I started really early. So basically, from my adult life, from 19 on, I've had children in my house. So they're absolutely a huge part of my daily existence. So I have a 36-year-old and I have a 16-year-old. So um, children, lots of impact in my life.
Would you say that that's also been a fortunate area of your life?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, that's really important as well. So the ruler of the fifth is the most positive planet in the chart, and it's in the first. And then because it's in the first, that's probably also, and because you've had children for most of the entirety of your adult life, that's probably also informed some ways in that you are in terms of your own personality and things like that, I would assume, right?
Absolutely. It's an intrinsic part of who I am, my realities, my children.
Got it. Okay. So all of that seems good, and those are good like teaching tools that it's reminding me of here. Just having a planet in the first house, whatever houses it rules, will tend to become more prominent in the person's life for better or worse. In your case, for the better. And then the last one is because it's also ruling the eighth house. You mentioned in passing that you've had positive things as a result of the partner's finances. Could you explain what you meant by that?
I'm very lucky. My husband's a physician, and so just monetarily, I'm lucky. Not only from my own work, my own business, but he has his own business, and so there's a lot of financial support from my husband. And then I did go to school taking out a bunch of student loans, and I had a lot of access to other people's money in the form of loans. So yeah, I just that house is pretty easy for me as well. I'm hoping for an easy death.
Nice. And then have you ever had any like inheritances or anything like that?
I have not had that so far. It's been more from my partner. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Just wanted to go through the list of like different
Yeah.
check boxes. Um, awesome. Well, this is really cool. Thank you so much for sharing that example. I appreciate it.
You,
All right. Take care.
you too.
All right. That was great. Um, cool. So yeah, it's good to alternate and look at different examples and different manifestations. And, that's the whole point of all of this is as astrologers, we have to um, explore the entire spectrum of like different human experiences and especially sometimes try to establish the extremes and then move inwards from there and figure out what the different shades of gray are in between. But it's cool sometimes when you can establish that and then really start to articulate some very fundamental things just based on very basic building blocks. And then from there, you can make things a little bit more complicated, but it's important to start with the very basics. All right, so I'm back from break. I would like to talk a little bit about Saturn examples. So we've done like Mars, we've done Jupiter. I'd like to do a Saturn example, and I think Aaron, you had one involving braces. Would you be up for joining me on camera right now? So this is a transiting example instead of a natal example, but I think it still could be a good one.
Hi,
There we go.
Chris. Can you see
Hey,
me?
thanks for joining me.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, what's your birth data?
It's 9th of May, 2002.
And your ascendant is 1 degree of Pisces?
Yes.
Cool. All right, so let me show the chart. There we go. So 1 degree of Pisces, and you said that when Saturn moved into your first house last year, when it moves into Pisces, that you got braces?
Yeah, I think it was around like August, late August that I got my braces. And I think it's like a very Saturnian because from what I know, it kind of like rules the teeth and the bones. And I'm having it for like another year, and now it's like mid Pisces. So I'll have it for like throughout the whole Pisces transit. So I think that's like a very good Saturn example, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's perfect. So what led to that or what caused that? What did the doctors like how did the situation arise?
Honestly, it's just been one of my own goals to like improve my appearance. And I guess I just thought of another example. The same week that I got my braces, I also got a perm for my hair, which made it curly. So I was like in a journey to improve my appearance and my health. And I guess the brace is more the health part. But yeah,
Nice. So yeah, so just sort of like transformations when it comes to body and health and
mhm,
appearance.
yeah,
And the braces thing though is perfect in terms of the timing, since like you said, you'll have that from the start of that transit to essentially the end of that transit, since Saturn is going to
yes,
go into Aries next year.
yeah.
So
And
in that,
actually the same, sorry, yeah.
go ahead.
The same week that I got my perm and my braces, I also got a job. So I think maybe the 10th house kind of is like activated in that way
Sure.
as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you have so many Gemini placements as well, and so many fourth
Yes.
and 10th house placements at the
Yeah.
same time that some of that would have been activated as well. And then
hmm
with the braces, that's something that has like a routine as well in terms of like things you need to do to like maintain it, right?
hmm Every like 3 to 4 weeks, I have to go to an appointment. I have to take like care of my teeth at home. And it's funny that you mentioned the fourth house because I got the job because of my sister, because she
Hmm.
was a manager there, and I got it because of her. And now at my job, it's like a Pilates studio. So I just recently like also started doing Pilates to improve my spine and my posture,
Hmm.
which is both for like aesthetics but also for my health, which is like related to my job as well. And it's like appearance, job, and family in a way. But also the
Right.
benefit of like the Jupiter ruling or the benefit of like getting this thing like opportunity from my workplace that is like health related and um like I guess Saturnian with like the spine and the teeth and everything.
Yeah, that's a really good point because
Yeah.
both bones are associated with Saturn, but also the teeth. And that's a really common thing that comes up with Saturn transits is things involving either of those, as well as things where you're like correcting something, but it takes a long, extended period of time to correct it rather than something that's just done once and quickly.
Yes, that's very true.
Nice. Okay. Well, that's a good and pretty straightforward examples. So
Yeah,
it'll be interesting to see, when Saturn goes into Aries and departs from Pisces, as you emerge from this period and have
yeah,
been sort of like transformed by that physically in different ways, as well as to another extent, sort of mentally, because there's also can be a period of, having to change the way that you're approaching things mentally and needing to develop better habits can be like a common first house Saturn transit experience.
definitely, because I feel like the Saturn transiting my first house has helped me in a lot of ways to be more consistent. And I think the braces was just like the first step because like now I can actually maintain proper dental hygiene and working out a couple times a week and being organized in other ways and like more dedicated and determined and all of that.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
one of the things that happens is it's like when we have those Saturn transits, especially through the angular houses, and especially if a person already has Saturn angular, it's like you go through those periods of focusing on those things and that being heightened. And then you'll go through a several year period of Saturn going through other houses in which you'll have to really test and see if you can keep up the regularity and the focus and like determination you had when the Saturn transit was at its most intense. And then eventually, like 7 years later, when it gets to the next mutable sign for you, which will be your Saturn return, that'll be the check-in period where you sort of see if you've been able to keep up that momentum and that progress. And if you did, then you graduate and move on to the next level. Versus if you don't, then sometimes you have to go back and do things over again. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's a really good example. Thanks a lot for sharing that.
Yeah, no worries. But I just remembered my thought actually about like the Saturn squaring uh like fourth house stuff. And that was like when I got my braces like August last year and I could like not speak for like 2 weeks straight. I don't know if that's like related to transits or not.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Saturn not being able to speak and being physically withheld from doing something is a very Saturn, because Saturn's primary meaning and signification oftentimes is it negates things and it says no or stop to something. So having
Yeah.
it say no or stop to speech or communication is pretty perfect, especially since you have like a Mercury Saturn conjunction natally, and so that's part of what would have been getting activated by Saturn squaring that.
Yeah, and I still have that because there's like an arch like going across my palate, so I can't touch my tongue like on the roof. So it still affects my speech, but I've gone through a lot of like speech therapy this year to help with that because I used to speak like properly and faster, but now I have to slow down so I can enunciate my words. But
Mm,
until I get that off and then my brace is off, I cannot speak. So maybe for the next year, my speech is like affected. But yeah, I just wanted to share that.
that's perfect. I love that. That's such a great manifestation of that and just the activation of those placements. But then, also with Venus there, offsetting things, you have a lot of good offsetting things at the same time. So there's like a temporary surmountable difficulty that's come up that stopped you from speaking, but it's something where through great effort and striving and determination, you're able to overcome it, which was a common like Saturn transit experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I would love to share my fourth house stories with you one day because there's a lot of them.
Yeah, well, I definitely maybe when we get to the fourth house, yours would be a good example because I'm hoping to do a series where we go through each of the houses, and I'll remember your Gemini stellium.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
All right. That was great. So now we've done some Saturn. I think that was really good as a contrast because we've already seen now the different types of things that come up with Saturn in terms of like slowing down things, in terms of stopping things, in terms of needing to like exercise or build something up slowly, are great Saturn themes that can manifest both in terms of a natal placement with Saturn there or in terms of a Saturn transit. So there were some other examples now that I think about it, um, that came in through Twitter. So this was a response when I put out a call for questions, and the astrologer Ray Merriman, who's a financial astrologer on Twitter, said, "When Uranus crossed my ascendant, I discovered astrology. When Pluto crossed my ascendant 2 years later, I got drafted and disrupted my life for 2 years. But it made me a better trained counselor for astrology, for my astrology career, which also grew during that time." So I thought that was really brilliant. Example of sometimes what happens when planets are crossing the degree of the ascendant, especially if it's a slow moving outer planet. It can be kind of a life changing, sometimes if it's a really slow moving planet, like a once in a lifetime changing event that occurs at that time. And Ray's chart's actually on astro.com. It's public, so I think I can show it. So here's his chart with late Virgo rising, 27 degrees of Virgo rising. And so, of course, he was talking about the Pluto Uranus conjunction in like the late 1960s that was happening in late Virgo was going over his ascendant. So, first starting with Uranus and then with Pluto. So, and with Uranus, I think I actually had the same thing. I had Uranus hit my ascendant when I discovered astrology as well. And I think part of the reason that that happens for some astrologers is it can be kind of like a disruptive and unexpected thing to discover that all of this works. But it can also be kind of like a revolutionary and like life-changing and really exciting thing to suddenly be thrust into like the middle of this world of astrology and everything that it can do, and to be kind of swept up in that. Um, by contrast, having Pluto transit over his ascendant must have been, I assume, really scary to get drafted, just because then there's the potential to, get sent off to a war. In his instance, it was the war in Vietnam, and have the potential to literally like die in a war that you don't want to be fighting in and may or may not agree with at the time. Um, that can be really, really scary. So having Pluto transiting over your ascendant sometimes and having the fear of, death or something like that come to the forefront in one's life. But also the transformative aspect of going through that over that few year period. So that's a really good example. In the live chat, Ibru Altan says that's so true. Uranus transiting opposite my ascendant. I started studying astrology. That's really cool. Does anybody else have any in the live chat have any examples of that, of a outer planet transit going over the degree of your ascendant and having some major life-changing event? Yael says, Uranus conjunct my ascendant. I dyed my hair blue. That's a great example. Having a Uranus transit over the ascendant and having a radical change of one's appearance is a pretty common one. And that actually brought up one other I was going to share. That was a good one that somebody submitted, where they saw certain aspects of their chart and what was indicating it, but I actually noticed a transit for them that they hadn't noticed. So this one came in through Twitter. The username is Conrad Kloss at Phospheros. So they said, during my third house year ruled by the moon, there was a lunar eclipse in my seventh house, and I was deep in a gender muddle. 2 weeks later, when the moon transited my first house and my ascendant ruler also got there, I realized and accepted that I'm trans, which I didn't plan for. I didn't plan this, obviously. So this was a really good example because there were like a few different things that were relevant there. I'm going to pull up the chart here on Twitter. So here's the chart that Conrad sent in, and it has the ascendant at 15 degrees of Taurus. And the thing that I noticed immediately from the transits is you can see the transits in green on the outer wheel, and Uranus was right there at like 15, 16 degrees of Taurus. So transiting Uranus was actually transiting over the degree of their ascendant right at the time that they had this realization that they were trans. So they said that the second chart is the day that they realized that they were trans, when Venus actually entered Taurus that day. So it entered into the rising sign. And they're pointing out the lunar eclipse in Scorpio was 2 weeks earlier. But one of the things that's interesting about that, and the fact that the nodes were transiting through Taurus and Scorpio, is that means that for like a year and a half or pretty much 2 year period, eclipses would have been bouncing back and forth between not just the seventh house, but also the first house. So that can be a very common thing that happens, is that a person can experience major transformations in terms of their sense of self, their sense of body, and even sometimes like their physical appearance when you're having major transits going on through your first house, seventh house axis. So it wasn't just that Uranus was conjoining the ascendant, but also that eclipses were taking place in the first house and the seventh house throughout that period. So there's a bunch of different things going on that's very relevant. And I just thought that was such a great example that they shared. And it's also a good example that sometimes, as astrologers, we can see certain things in our charts, but then sometimes it's helpful to talk about our chart or share it with other astrologers, because sometimes other astrologers can see things that maybe we missed or maybe we didn't see when we were looking at it or when we were experiencing the transits ourselves. But I thought that was such a great example of just the types of transformative experiences that can sometimes happen. And sometimes you don't have a good sense of, like I said earlier, what the first house means when we say that it signifies self or that it signifies you in the chart. That sounds like such an abstract concept that we don't usually have a real conceptualization of what that means until we go through a really intense either outer planet transit or a set of eclipses through the first house. And then all of a sudden we're thinking about that topic in terms of who we are, how we're showing up in the world, and different things like that in a very intimate way. And then all of a sudden you really understand what the first house is all about. But sometimes it takes that experience of having like a real visceral transit through the first house to open your eyes to what that's like. In the live comments, Angela says eclipses in my first/seventh was when my best friend died of COVID, and it was a big identity shift of who I was without a best friend. Was also known as part of the best friend pair. Yeah, that's really can be a major thing because it's usually when eclipses are happening in our first house, it means they're also happening in our seventh house, and sometimes it's redefining our sense of self and who we are, but sometimes it's through contrasting that or defining it relative to other people that we have really close intimate relationships with in our life. I did a whole episode. I've done a few episodes on eclipses before, and eclipses can be really good ones that can show activations of the self and different things like that, especially in contrast with the other. Is there anybody else that has a good example like that? One. So Olivia says, I think I got my ears pierced when Mars was transiting over my ascendant and Venus was transiting my first. That's a pretty good one. Joe says, I'm going through the North Node is going through the first. Kids are all grown up, and now I'm trying to figure out what to do next that I'd find fulfilling. That's definitely a good one in terms of redefining one's sense of self at the end of something, especially because eclipses represent major endings, but also major beginnings. So sometimes there's the end of one chapter in our life and the beginning of a new chapter. And sometimes in the first house, that new chapter relates to our sense of self, but also who we are in relation to others with the seventh. Sherry in the chat says, I was taking a yoga class when I was 25, and the instructor gave everyone an astrological chart she had prepared. That was 1971 when transiting Uranus was conjoining my ascendant. That was when I first got hooked on learning astrology. That's really cool. So yeah, there's a lot of astrologers that have had that Uranus transit to the ascendant or to the first house. Hebrew Alton says, I got married in the first house eclipses in 1997. That's really good because that's a real like re um, renewal in terms of identifying yourself in relation to others. Lisa also says I got married while the North Node was transiting my first. And anytime the North Node is or the South Node is transiting a house, that also means eclipses are taking place in those houses at that time. Lindsay says Uranus was opposite my ascendant and Mars, the ruler of the fourth, when my house burned down. I lost my childhood photos and home videos, which later inspired me to do photography as a career. That's a really striking one. All right, let me look at my other examples that I wrote down that came in. So I put a bunch of these in a document, so I'll just share some of those now. So Iana on Twitter says, I left for college while Jupiter was transiting my first house, but I didn't gain the freshman 15, I gained the freshman 30. So that's a really good one because that's a common sort of thing that astrologers say can happen in terms of a Jupiter transit through the first house is Jupiter is about growth and expansion. So sometimes a Jupiter transit through the first house can be about like gaining weight, whereas a Saturn transit sometimes can be about losing weight. Although that's sometimes tricky because sometimes Saturn transits can also be periods of low health and vitality where you're moving more slowly and having more difficulty, which itself can sometimes lead to weight gain. Yana also said, my mom has Jupiter in her first, and although she's been in some seriously life-threatening situations, she comes out unscathed every time. She's had 3 cars have engine problems. The first car she sued and won a brand new car that got paid off. The other 2, a man found a loophole, free rental and repair. Let me also add that Jupiter is also the ruler of her 3rd house of short distance travel, and it falls in her first. So that's pretty interesting. Mandy says in the live chat, I started mental health meds when the eclipses were on my 1st house, 7th house axis. I wanted to be a better me and for the people most important to me. Yeah, that's a really good one. That makes a lot of sense. And to do something partially, not just for yourself, but also for other people that are close to you in your life. That could be a good one if you feel like talking about it, if it's not too sensitive, if you feel like joining me. Hey,
Hi.
hey, so what's your birth data?
November 12th, 1985.
All right. And is your ascendant 26 Cancer?
It is.
All right. So 26 Cancer, and for those listening to the audio version, so you have 26 Cancer rising, and Capricorn's your 7th house. And then the ruler of the ascendant is the moon, and it's at 28 Scorpio, and it's applying to conjunction with Saturn at 29 Scorpio. So you said that when eclipses started happening in your 1st and 7th houses, that you decided to start working on mental health just in order to take better care of yourself as well as other people that are close to you.
Yes. Um, this is funny because this is like the second time I've gotten to talk to you in this way on one of these live things. And the last time you mentioned that because I was born during a solar eclipse, that the eclipses might be more significant as far as events in my life go. So I started kind of researching what was going on in my life during the time of different eclipses. And it was in 2018, in the summer of 2018, my son was almost a year old, and my anxiety had gotten to the point where I just couldn't manage it anymore. So I sought medical help for that. And
And the anxiety
yeah,
arose, was it like a postpartum depression thing, or what did the anxiety arise from?
a lot of childhood trauma. But I think what really, like the stressor that really exacerbated it was my living situation had completely changed. We moved into a new house. There were elderly members of our family that we had to take care of and move to assisted living. And my own personal health, like I was no longer able to work outside the home kind of thing. So a lot of physical restrictions. And then
my son being born, like everything just kind of happened all at once. And yeah, I was like, something's got to be done about this because I'm Cancer rising. And what I told the psychiatrist was, I just want to be able to go to the grocery store because the way the anxiety affected me, I just wanted to like crawl in a hole. Like, I remember sometimes just when I was trying to get dressed, just sitting in the closet and like hiding from the whole world. So I was like in my little crab shell just to get away from everything.
Yeah, so it's a whole like process over a few year period. That's a really common experience also with eclipses, just because the nodes take like a year and a half or so to move through each of those signs. And every 6 months during that period, for at least a year and a half or 2 years, you just have the eclipses bouncing back and forth between those signs and
Right.
activating some of that stuff. So Saturn also would have been going through your seventh house of relationships, and that's also where eclipses would have been happening. If we're talking about what was the time frame you said again?
It was summer of 2018. My son was born in 2017, so he was almost a year old when I got to the point where I just couldn't. I got tired of living like that, I guess you could say.
Right. Yeah. Uh,
At first, it was at first my reason for doing it was my family deserves better than this. But as I've gone through the process, I discovered that I deserve better than this. So I thought like the whole first seventh house thing was hitting pretty hard on that one.
Right. And so, I mean, that's a common experience as well, in terms of sometimes this feeling of like teeter-tottering back and forth between sometimes like emphasizing other people more or feeling like you need to, versus emphasizing yourself more and putting yourself and your own needs forward
Mhm.
more. So it sounds like you're experiencing some of that as well.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. It's crazy because that was pretty much the whole like the root of the anxiety, like the childhood trauma really had to do with my mother and feeling like I didn't deserve to exist and take up space in the world. Um, and then like the ruler of my first house is in the fifth house in Scorpio. So I don't know, there's a lot of mom issues going on that I had to heal.
Hmm.
And it was yeah, yeah, but that eclipse is I think kind of what triggered it, maybe astrologically speaking.
Yeah. Do you feel like you emerged from that set of eclipses in Cancer and Capricorn with a greater sense of yourself and like who you are and what you need in life?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And now everything, my Chiron is in, um, my Chiron is in Gemini. So now like everything is going over my Chiron, my 12th house, and it's kind of coming back into Cancer now, all the outer planets and stuff. And about a month or so ago is when I was able to stop taking my anxiety medicine, which was like a huge deal for me. My shrink said that she thought, and like in her professional opinion, you know, that I had worked through things that I needed to work through, and she thought I would be okay without it. And um, it's just weird when you look at like your own transits and how the planets are moving, and you can kind of see the cycles of everything, and it's just so fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. And just seeing sometimes good transits and being able to sometimes measure one's progress that you've made over the years. I feel like that can be really helpful having that perspective.
Yeah, when you see it in retrospect, it's like, wow.
Right. Totally. All right. Well, that's a really good example. Thanks for sharing that. I think that helped us like clarify what that can be like in terms of eclipses, and just sometimes gaining a better sense of yourself and who you are, but it being part of a process sometimes of revisiting that over and over again, rather than it just being like a one-time event.
Definitely, definitely.
Cool. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So Lindsay has one with Leo rising. That could be a good one. Are you still here, Lindsay R, with Leo rising with the Sun, Mercury, and Venus? All right. Hey.
Hi.
All right. What's your birth data?
August 10th, 1987.
And your ascendant is 23 Leo?
Yes.
All right. So for those listening to the audio version, we have a chart with 23 Leo rising. Mars is conjunct the ascendant at 22 Leo. The sun is in Leo at 17, then Venus at 13, and Mercury at 7 degrees of Leo. What else? Okay. And then, yeah, so what did you say happened again?
When I was in high school, my house burned down when Uranus was close to my descendant and opposite my Mars. And then around that same time, like a few months later, I met my partner, who I'm still together with today, and it's been like 20 years. So it was like a good and a bad thing that happened.
And you were also in a first house perfection year?
No, not at that time. I am in one right now.
Okay, got it. That's a really good example because this is like a interesting combination that comes up where Mars is the ruler of your fourth house of your home and living situation, and it's in the first house. And then it was like the activation of that partially, which where you had this negative experience of having your house burned down. What caused the fire?
It was like, I think a lot of houses burned. It was called the Cedar Fire. It was just like a mass, like a wildfire.
How did it impact you? Oh,
Okay,
wait, really
so
quickly. So it was a wildfire. So that was the other thing, is it just happened like suddenly
yeah.
and sort of quickly that your house and I'm guessing most of your possessions like burned down?
Yeah, we didn't take anything with us because the area that I lived, like there would be fires every year around October. So my mom was used to that warning. So she's like, we're not taking anything, like let's just go. So we
Hmm.
evacuated, but we didn't take anything with us. So we lost like everything.
Did that
And
cause any tensions with your mom because she was the one that said you shouldn't take anything?
yeah, a little bit. I mean, I was in high school, so I was always mad at her, but it was annoying.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Um, and then so you left and then everything burned down. And then did that affect, how did that affect you?
Um, it taught me to, like, I don't care about material possessions at all anymore, but I lost, like I said, I wrote in the chat, I lost all of my photos and my home videos, and I think about that all the time. And so I started just taking pictures myself and like really like caring a lot about photography and memories. And I now have just started getting into photography as a career.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice. That's really interesting. I mean, I'm looking at like the Mercury square Pluto at the same time and wondering if that's relevant, just that you had that experience of having, because I've been reflecting recently on the fourth house as having to do with the past, which isn't talked
Mhm.
about a lot in traditional significations, but it's pretty common modern signification. And just sometimes when fourth house transits happen, that there's something about the past that becomes the greater focus. But in your instance, it's like you, in that case, you literally in one swoop sort of had your past annihilated in some
Mhm.
sense by having your photos and videos wiped out. But then that's caused you to think about that direction more and to like actually start working on that as a potential career.
Mhm. And I think the South Node was in Scorpio at the time too, so the eclipses were happening there.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so eclipses were happening in your fourth house, but then that means eclipses also would have been happening in your 10th
Mhm.
house at the same time. So it may
Yeah.
have laid the seeds for like a future career and been both an ending, but also a potential beginning.
Yeah.
That's super cool. And then, so how long after that did you say you met your partner?
A few months after, well, I knew him, but we didn't get together until that was October, and then we got together in December. So it was like 3 months later.
Yeah, that's really close. So, and that was kind of like unexpected because you were you like anticipating like getting in a relationship after
No,
that
not
like
really.
traumatic experience?
we were kind of talking, like we were friends for a while, and so I think that was kind of happening at the same time. But I wasn't really expecting like to enter a really long relationship. That was not on my mind at all.
Right. And then so it ended up being, but it ended up much to your surprise because you probably also didn't think it would last for very long.
No.
So there was something surprising about just the fact that it turned into this enduring thing in the first place.
Yeah, I'm still surprised.
That's funny. Well, it's interesting also because you kind of have a Uranus signature in your chart with Saturn, Aquarius on the seventh house, and Saturn is ruling this seventh house of relationships, and it's
Mhm.
in Sagittarius in the fifth house conjunct Uranus. So it's like both of those themes of both like Saturn and things that are enduring, but also Uranus and things that are unexpected or sort of come out of nowhere as like part of the signature for you of relationships.
Yeah.
Nice. That's a great example. One last thing, it's like Mars is also ruling your ninth house. And
Mhm.
so in other examples where I've had a few examples of like one was like a client where they had Mars in the first house in the day chart and ruling the fourth house and the ninth house. And it was like they grew up in a religious household where their father was really religious and it connected those themes of fourth and ninth house, but then it was experienced as being very negative for the native with Mars in the first, but for you, because you have Jupiter there in the ninth, it's like offsetting, I would think, some of the negativeness of Mars or potential downsides of Mars ruling the ninth house. How has that worked out for you, or has the ninth house component come into play at all?
Yeah. Um, it's been good and bad, but it's definitely much better than my fourth house. My ninth house. So I grew up in Utah, which is heavily Mormon, and we were not Mormon. So I didn't get invited to a lot of the stuff that, people would do because of my religion. And then I went to a private Christian school, but I wasn't Christian either. So I didn't fit in there. And then my mom, she would go to like an ashram in India. So I spent a lot of time there, which was positive. And then I travel a lot and I had a travel blog for a while. Um, I like the ninth house.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Um, So that's interesting though that it's like on the one hand you experienced negative things and that you because of where you lived in a highly religious area, but you
Hmm.
weren't of that religion, that you were sort of like ostracized in a way, or in a more of an outsider that you would have been otherwise. Um, but then your mom went to an ashram, but they had you go to a Christian school.
Yeah. And I just went there because my friend was going there and I didn't want to be separated from her. So she let me.
Okay, that's funny. And then your mom going to an ashram in India, does that mean she had more like alternative
Like more
spirituality?
Eastern beliefs. And we went to like it was kind of like Sunday school, but every week they taught us about a different religion. So we just learned about all of them. She was just really like open-minded and wanted us to learn everything.
Wow, that's wild. That's really cool because in this instance, it's like it's not the parents necessarily that are causing problems. And it's interesting that with Jupiter at 29 degrees of Aries in the ninth house, that it's trining that Mars and that ascendant, which is interesting because it's both mitigating, but it's also protecting them. Um, and offsetting like some of the things that could be negatives. So maybe that's partially interesting and just in terms of, for example, that you did escape from the fire and it didn't turn into like a life-threatening event or something like that, or you have had some of those experiences of challenging things involving either where you lived or religion, but
Mhm.
that's also been a great area of positive things for you at the same
Mhm.
time.
Definitely. Yeah. A lot of growth and just experiences and stuff.
Yeah, that's amazing. Are there any other ways that your like first house or first house stellium or like transits through your first house have manifested in your life that are worth mentioning?
Um, I I mean, it's kind of like my appearance has been like the bane of my existence. So I feel like that's, related. I have like major body image issues, major like self-esteem issues, to the point where I think I might need therapy.
So is that something you've always struggled with, or is it
Yeah,
something that's
always.
Okay, so like struggling with body image issues and just is it something that you've gotten help for in the past, or is it something you just think you might need to?
I have gotten like a little bit of help for it. But yeah, it feels like really like overwhelming a lot of the time.
Okay. Yeah, I mean that can definitely be a thing with some of the first house placements is just struggling with that a little bit or yeah, but it's nice that you have like offsetting positive placements there at the same time. So
Yeah.
even if you have that challenging placement there with Mars, that having Venus there and having Jupiter overcoming that and potentially having a way to deal with that and like make it not as bad or not seem as bad as you might feel like it is at different points in time.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Cool. All right. That was a really actually amazing example. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. That was great. All right, let me check the comments. Everyone's pointing out that Lindsay's gorgeous, so that's, good to hear sometimes. And sometimes I think that's something that people sometimes with when you have challenging things related to the first house can struggle with is sometimes like, what if everyone else thinks that you're great, but what if you struggle with feeling like you're not or something like that, and how to rectify that. And sometimes I think it brings up a point. Actually, that brings up a great point with the first house that sometimes our perceptions of things can be skewed and can be off. And that's actually one of the challenging things when you are working on the first house, especially is sometimes our own perceptions of our life are not always, they're always informed by our own subjective experience. So sometimes if there's somebody that's standing outside of our life looking in, they may have a much different perception of our life from an objective standpoint than we do in terms of our subjective experience. And sometimes that's really important to take into account. And that's something actually that's really helpful with astrology is that it does give you a way of like standing outside of things and looking at our lives objectively. But sometimes what we see is so different than how we're used to conceptualizing our lives that sometimes we can struggle to like reconcile those two things. But I think it can be really actually helpful for that reason. Okay, I'm trying to look and see if there's ones that might present a different aspect of the first house that we haven't covered so far, or ones that jogged my memory of things that I meant to cover. Yeah, that's a good one. So Jeannie says I have Saturn conjunct the ascendant in the first house. In Sagittarius, as soon as Saturn went retrograde last year, I broke 2 teeth and I was in a second house Saturn ruled year. Planets at the ascendant can show up in the physical body when something is happening to the houses ruled by the planet in the first. Yeah, that's a really great point. And yeah, things related to the bones or to teeth are really common Saturn things when they're connected to the first house. Um, I don't know if Kristen is still here with Aquarius rising. First house perfection year was 2020. Health issues. I'm not sure if that was the one. There was one where somebody submitted that they got COVID and they got like long COVID in that year with early Aquarius rising, but I don't know if you're the same person. It is? Okay. Um, I think that would be interesting to go through just as another type of Saturn one if you want to join me on camera. Hey,
Hi,
thanks for joining me.
thank you for having me.
All right. What's your birth data?
It is January 12th, 1984.
All right. It's 2 Aquarius rising.
Yep.
All right. So for those listening to the audio version, you have 2 Aquarius rising, and the ruler of the ascendant is Saturn, which is at 14 degrees of Scorpio in the 10th whole sign house, and it's conjunct Pluto at 1 Scorpio and Mars at 0 Scorpio. So what was your example again?
Yeah. So well, there are a lot of things that happened basically during that whole year really, because it was a first house perfection year, basically through the whole of 2020. And I had a number of health issues. At the beginning of the year, it started with my stomach just kind of shutting down completely. I ended up with gastroparesis and ended up losing 30 pounds because I couldn't eat anything. And had to go to the emergency room because I couldn't drink anything either for days.
Wow.
And it was like months of that. And then March, I had got COVID, and then that turned into long COVID. And it like wasn't super bad, and then it started to get better, and then all of a sudden it got way worse to the point where like I literally thought that I was going to die a few times because I had collapsed multiple times, like gasping for air, and I couldn't breathe. And there was a point I was going to call 911, and then I passed out. So I didn't have insurance at the time, so I just kept putting it off and putting it off, and like, I don't want that bill. And then it turned into long COVID, and then I've just kept having multiple issues. It took a good year before I started to kind of get back to normal, and there were just loads of issues. And then like
So what were your symptoms for long COVID for those that aren't familiar with that?
A lot of fatigue. I mean, part of it was fatigue, like extreme fatigue. Like I just couldn't get up. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't do anything. I had no energy. Like I would try to take my like trash can out to the street, and then it would take me like days or weeks to get it back in, because I couldn't get up out of bed. I spent 2 months just pretty much in the bed. I was thankfully working from home. But it's just, I couldn't get up. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't do anything. And then I couldn't breathe. My dog is in the trash. And I couldn't breathe at all. I was just kind of like constantly, still for like months, gasping for air. Trying to remember. I had a lot of nosebleeds. I had a lot of issues with my heart. Trying to even remember. And I'm distracted by my dogs. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so it turned into like a long chronic issue with Saturn, like going through your first house. And, I have Aquarius rising, and I also got sick in March of 2020. So I had a lot of really similar things with long COVID. But one of the things you're describing, I think that's hard to convey to people that was so interesting symbolically, just to stand outside of it as an astrologer, is how the feelings of like slowness and tiredness and like not having the physical energy to do anything and being almost immobilized as a result of that is very evocative of Saturn going through the first house of body, and then all of a sudden being restricted in what you're able to do for very long periods of time, and having to readjust your sense of self and who you are and what you can accomplish based on these new sets of limitations.
Yeah, and it was a big difference because I had like just regained, because I have a ton of health issues in general, and I had kind of gotten myself to a place where I was doing so much better, and then COVID kind of knocked me down and took all that away, and I was like, no. So it was, that was definitely a thing, and there were so many issues with that, and just it just lasted and lasted, and it was ever evolving, and then kind of also another thing that had happened during that year is my husband and I had separated right at the beginning of that year, and I was living by myself for like the first time ever. I've always lived with somebody, and so it was weird. It was it was just me, and there was this kind of chance of figuring out like, who am I and what do I like and what do I want to do, and just a lot of self-discovery. And that was something that I never really truly got to do before, because there's always been everybody else around me and and focusing on everybody else and doing for others. And so it was like first time of being able to just kind of focus on myself.
It's amazing. So there's a real sense of of on the one hand, like being on your own for the first time. So a sense probably on some days of like loneliness or isolation compared to what came before. But then also through that loneliness and isolation, also a period of like finding yourself at the same time.
Yeah, and yeah, definitely a lot of periods of ups and downs. And you know, I know what there was, and my son is at 21 Capricorn, so like there was that whole mess of like Jupiter and Pluto were pretty much exact, really close to my sun. Saturn had just entered Aquarius, really close to my ascendant, and then Mars was kind of like right between my sun and ascendant, and just going through that whole area. And then that was squaring like Mars, Pluto, my moon, all that. It's fun times. Fun times.
Yeah. So you really got hit by, especially the early part of Saturn and Aquarius when it was right on
Yeah.
your ascendant, because then it was like it immediately squared your Mars, Pluto conjunction, and it immediately squared your moon at the beginning of Taurus at 5 Taurus. Um, and then even once you got past that, then you went into your Saturn square where it was squaring
Yeah.
Saturn, the ruler of the ascendant at 14 Scorpio.
Yep.
And that's a good example also that sometimes if people have like the degree of the ascendant early in the sign, sometimes the most intense part comes like right at the beginning of the transit of a planet through the first house. Whereas there's other examples where if the ascendant was at the very end of the sign, sometimes even though the events and circumstances surrounding the first house transit begin as soon as the ingress into the sign, the rising sign takes place, but the most intense part for those people doesn't come until like later, like the end. But it's interesting for you that it was just right at the beginning.
Yeah, it hit really hard, and it kind of, it stayed, but I mean, eventually eventually it got better. So
Do you feel
yeah.
like after Saturn departed from Aquarius, like it's been going through Pisces over the past year, did was there, even though it's still ongoing, was there a lessening or an ability to manage some of the chronic health issues more, or where are you at with all that?
Yeah, I mean they've improved. They've definitely improved. Like a lot of the COVID stuff I mean, there's still some things like I've never really fully gotten better,
Mhm.
but it is better than it was. Some of the health stuff is better. My issues with my stomach are still there, but way better managed. And then I also have POTS, which COVID had worsened. And that got to be like my heart was just, every time I try to get up, I would pretty much almost pass out. That's better controlled now. A lot of that stuff is much better managed. It's still kind of there, but like better managed. And then as far as the relationship stuff, that had also kind of followed that same sort of thing of evolving throughout that. And then it went into my second house, and that's been a whole thing. So yeah, big
Right.
Saturn.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I appreciate seeing your chart because you're born like a year before me, but you have such a similar chart, and it's interesting to have two people with similar charts have very similar experiences during that period. So even though it's not
Yeah.
positive in terms of examples, obviously for either of us, it's at least nice to see. It's good to see other people who had similar experiences with similar transits, so that you can kind of like resonate with that.
Yeah, it definitely is. There's something nice about that. For
Yeah.
sure. Like Aaron, I was mentioning the Mars Pluto. I was like, I can appreciate this.
Yeah. And I think that's really important. And that's one of the reasons I like doing this series is just so different people can see people with similar placements as them and how sometimes you have that resonance of experiencing similar things and sometimes that just being almost like therapeutic in a way to some extent.
Yes, therapeutic. That is the perfect word. Yes, there's something nice about that, about being able to kind of share that. Know that you're not alone, right? And it's like somebody gets you. somebody can kind of resonate with what you're going through, and nobody's really ever alone, even though sometimes it feels like that. Nobody's, you know, we've all got somebody. We all have people.
Yeah. So the last thing is just as Saturn went through your first house, one of the things I experienced, and I don't know, maybe you had this experience, but having to focus on your health so much and to try to make improvements any way you could, and also learning different things about your body and learning about how you react to different things, maybe more than you had up to that point. So that it's not, you're not loving that you're having to do that, but that there is like this process of at least learning different things to try to manage or make things better. Do you feel like you went through that over that like 3 year period of Saturn through your first house?
Yes, definitely. And partly with, yeah, my heart and my lungs not doing as well, and trying to figure out like what are my limits and how can I take better care of myself, and what do I need, and same with my stomach, and what foods are safe and what's not, and a lot of experimenting and testing things out and trying to learn about what's good or not, or what works or doesn't, and a lot of just testing, like I said, testing everything and seeing how does my body feel, how do I feel, how do I react to that. Oh, and then yeah, another thing I just thought about is during that period too was really also another thing as far as self and appearance goes, because I think that was the first time that I've noticed that like I really was starting to show my age, which
Mm.
was not fun. Because everybody's always been like, "Oh, you look like you're 20," and then surprised that I have kids, and especially kids that are as old as they are. And so I think that it was during that period where, like, and I think it was because my stomach issues, and that, like, I was not getting anything that I needed, and I think all the stress of everything kind of aged me a little bit, and malnutrition and whatnot, and it was, so that was a little bit of not a fun kind of moment. And I had,
Yeah.
during COVID, like I lost my hair thinned out a lot from that, and that was really hard too. So those were two other things related to the self. But yeah, there was a lot of just kind of testing things and figuring out you know my body, and what worked or what didn't, and how to live with the new me. And
Yeah.
so yeah.
Age is definitely a big one. I'm glad you mentioned that because during Saturn transits, the concept of our age can like come up in the concept of time and getting older or hitting certain landmarks. And especially when it's going through your first house, sometimes there can be experiences where it feels like it's aged you many years, like very rapidly during the course of that transit.
Yeah.
Or other times, sometimes beginning to show the effects of age or other things like that. I always mention on like the podcast as one of my like funny Saturn return transits with Saturn ruling my ascendant, that when Saturn conjoined itself, that I lost my hair. And that was part of my like first house transformation, was going from a period in my life where I had hair to going from a period where I didn't, and that being a real change for me in terms of my appearance and other things, but also it was part of like age as well, and like hitting different ages when your body's like doing different things. So that's a great one. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a big one. So
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And thanks. I hope you're able to, I hope for, all of our sakes that it is something that gets better, or they're able to find some way to like fix in the long term, or at least improve in some ways. But I guess we'll see. We'll see what happens.
thank you. You too.
All
Appreciate
right.
you.
Yeah. All right. All right, so I'm back from break. So we've covered so far mostly planets in houses in the first house. We've covered transits through the first house. The last section that we haven't covered much at all yet is the ruler of the ascendant being placed in different houses of the chart. And this is actually really crucial because the ruler of the ascendant, the first house in ancient astrology was referred to as the helm, and like the steering wheel of a ship. And the ruler of the ascendant then was sometimes said to be the steersman of the ship and would direct the life towards a certain direction or towards certain topics. So one of the things that you want to do when you're looking at the first house is you also want to look and see what planet is the planet that rules the sign of the ascendant, and then what house it's placed in the chart. And the ruler of the ascendant, whatever house that is that the ruler of the ascendant is placed in, usually the topic associated with that house or some of the topics associated with it will become particularly important or prominent in the life of the native in some way. And sometimes the native's life is actually steered towards those topics in some very striking or distinctive way. So one of the people, one person actually submitted an example of this, an astrologer named Margaret Cahill. So Margaret has Libra rising, and the ruler of the ascendant is Venus, which is placed in Gemini in the ninth whole sign house. And Margaret actually became a publisher of astrology books. She's actually the founder of Wessex Publishing, or Wessex Books, which is basically one of the main publishing houses for astrology books today that's published a lot of really important and prominent astrological titles. Just last month, the book on Uranus, or on Marin de Villefranche, that I did an interview on, was published by Wessex. So this is a great example of somebody whose career and life direction has been very much focused on ninth house topics, since the ninth house is the primary house that has to do with publishing and astrology. And if you ever publish a book, or if you ever write a book or do anything related to that, you'll often see the ninth house get activated when you publish a book or something related to it, or write a book. So I thought this was a great example because it's one of the just examples of what happens when the ruler of the ascendant is in a specific house in the chart, that you really have to pay extra attention to that placement, because it will dictate some major themes or major topics that the life will be directed towards in some significant way. So the ruler of the ascendant is also important because sometimes the ruler of the ascendant represents you in the chart, and it represents what you're doing in your life and how you're showing up in your life. And sometimes that can be positive, and other times that can be more challenging. So in some of the recent webinars like this that we've done, we've seen some different placements of the ruler of the ascendant, and I did a whole webinar on it for students of my Hellenistic astrology course last month, where we went through each of the houses and different people shared their story of the ruler of the ascendant in a certain house. And in some instances, we could see how the ruler of the ascendant in one house was, when well placed or when it was benefics, that the native was doing good things in that area, or they were somehow good things were happening, were arising in that area of the life as a result of the native, sometimes naturally or indirectly, but other times directly as a result of something the native was actually bringing about. That can also happen, though, sometimes with challenging things. Like sometimes if the ruler of the ascendant is placed in a challenging way in the chart, it means that there can be challenges that arise as a result of actions that we take that bring about issues in our life, or where there can just be difficulties that arise sometimes that come from within us in the life. And sometimes that's really described by the ruler of the ascendant and its placement. So given that example, does anybody have a good ruler? Like, this is a topic that really requires a whole episode on its own, but maybe we can run through in the last little bit of this, if anybody has a good example, that just matches very quickly and very obviously the house topic. Let me just read through some of these right now. So Ibaru says, ruler of the ascendant in the 7th, my life story is relationships. That's really good. Jennifer says Aquarius rising ruler in the 5th, life revolves around finding my true purpose and joy and being a good mother. So yeah, raising your children as a major focus and topic of the life if the ruler of the ascendant in the 5th can definitely be one. There's a famous, I always use the example in my Hellenistic course. I think I used it in my book as well, of a famous children's book author, Judy Bloom, who has the ruler of the ascendant in the 5th house. And she started writing books for her children, but then eventually ended up like writing children's books, and becoming an award-winning author of children's books became part of her destiny. Elizabeth says the Mercury, the ruler of the ascendant in the whole sign 11th, and the importance of groups in my life. Yeah, groups, alliances, friends can be a major topic with the ruler of the ascendant in the 11th. Haley says Pisces rising, artist and ruler of the 6th house in Virgo, and perfectionism with craftsmanship is a good and bad for me. That's a pretty good one. Joe says I didn't really relate to being an Aries rising. I think due to my Mars being in the 7th, that's actually a common thing that sometimes when the ruler of the ascendant is in the 7th house, because then it'll take on the qualities of the sign that's opposite to the rising sign and is antithetical to it. Sometimes they won't relate to the rising sign significations as much. I've noticed there can be different ways that that can manifest in the chart, but that's definitely a possibility. Donata says Virgo rising, ruler in the 8th, Venus in the 8th, have been swindled out of a few inheritances, but still okay money-wise. That would be kind of an interesting one. Do you feel like sharing that on video?
Okay.
Hey, thanks for joining me.
Nice to meet you, Chris. Followed you for a long time. Love you.
Thank you. What's your birth data?
March 21, 1956.
Is your ascendant 20 Virgo?
Yes.
Yes.
28
Okay.
and change. Yes. Uh-huh.
Got it. All right. Wait, but hold on a second. I thought,
So is it my
um,
ruler of my, did I get that wrong?
yeah, we're looking for the ruler of the ascendant in a specific house, but it looks like the ruler of your ascendant would be in the 7th house,
What's the ruler of my ascendant?
Mercury in Pisces, right?
Oh, yes. Sorry.
That's okay.
Here, yes,
Um,
yes. I'm sorry, I messed that up.
That's okay. Well, I guess quick question then is just with the ruler of the ascendant in the 7th house, we would think that your life would have been directed towards relationships in some way, or that relationships would have been more important in your life for some specific reason. Is that true? And if so, in what way?
Yes, I actually had entered in the chat that I am currently finally legally ending a 52-year relationship with my spouse that started in high school at 16. And it only happened after my dear beloved in-laws passed away in 2022 and then 2023. And then in 2024, there was just an inner shift. So we've been separated, haven't done anything about it, and and I haven't wanted to, but I was just feeling like I was moving toward it, but I wasn't quite ready. I haven't been ready for like 12 years, so it's a long time. And then something shifted this year where I think it had to do with my relationship with my in-laws, they're not being here. And something shifted, and I'm now ready to like assume, I think I said that going from servant and power behind the throne kind of deal. And now I'm shifting into Aries and being seen. Because look at me, I've never been on. When you said video, my first thing is like, oh crap. And then, then I was like, no, I want to be seen. So it's just like a perfect example of this shift. It's crazy.
Yeah, this is actually really striking because, of course, Saturn entered Pisces a year ago in early 2023. So Saturn would have gone into your seventh house of relationships and then started conjoining the ruler of your ascendant, which is Mercury there. And so all of a sudden, yeah, you've started moving towards that and feeling like you're ready to do that and to end that relationship. And you said it had been for 56 years up to that point?
Yeah, we're in our 56th year, of partnership, boyfriend, girlfriend, and then live in whatever's. And then I didn't marry until I became pregnant in 92. So being married, it's been what? Legally married, it's been, 30 some years, 32 years. So it's been a it's been a long thing. But since I would say 2009, 2010 is when it was like, okay, this is not okay anymore. It's not nurturing me. I'm giving 120 million%, and I'm not getting enough back finally. I'm a long-suffering, good Virgo in that way. So, and what do you call it? Hiding my light. I have the Leo and the Aries, hiding that and just working behind the scenes and everybody shining the light on everyone else. And so about 2008, 2009, 2010, I was like, kind of feeling the handwriting that was on the wall, but I'm just not I'm not a quick, you see you later kind of person. I had my daughter. So, but then once she went off to college in 2010, I was like, okay, this is new. But again, what is it? It's 2020. That's 14 years later.
Yeah.
So,
Well, 2009 would have been Saturn going through Virgo. So it's like some of that stuff was coming up when Saturn was going through your first house. Um, but then, yeah, it's really, and even like the first few years of your marriage would have been in the mid 90s would have been Saturn going through Pisces the first time. And now you've gone through a full Saturn cycle and it's come back. It seems like it's tied in with that just because you have Saturn in Sagittarius in the fourth house. So it's like every time Saturn goes through one of the mutable signs, it's also your Saturn square or Saturn opposition or conjunction. So it's like these cycles of relationships are very much tied in with your Saturn transits at the same time.
oh, I can see that for sure. And it's also interesting, possibly being one of the older people, that you actually, when you mention long cycles, I say, oh, I've actually experienced that. Because I think the Aries part of me forgets my chronological age a lot.
Right. Yeah, Aries. I think Rick Levine said that the Aries are like the forever young sign in some ways.
Yeah. And
Um,
also the health thing. I've always been very healthy, which works out because I'm usually nursing and bringing back people from near death, with my strength. So it kind of has worked out, or sharing my energy, to help people heal.
Mhm.
I just did that naturally. And then finally, getting feedback from people, and animals too. I'm really good at that. I never recognized that because I never paid attention until you finally start listening to feedback from people as you get older. And you're like, huh, I think like 50,000 people have told me that. Maybe I need to listen to it.
Do you work in nursing?
No, I don't. I've done teaching, and I work with teenagers and children. I think I'm good at teaching. I'm good at nurturing. I'm good at teaching people to fish.
Mhm.
I'll give them a fish, but just sort of giving them the tools, young people, because I think my Mercury in Pisces, it gives me a lot of intuitive insight into people pretty quickly, so I can figure them out and be really very helpful. So I've made sure I've had real impact on, again, the feedback on the various young people later in life. And I love that. And I'm actually getting back into that, went into, making a living. And now that I have more time, I'm actually getting back into making books a birthright, a project where, it's babies and books. I love books and I love little kids. So, it's like this thing that naturally energizes me. So I've been away from young people. Well, I work at a university, so I'm around a lot of young people, but I'm now actually in my own time also going to get back to just helping guide, young people in their lives, and just, plant a little seed and off they go.
Nice. So the last thing with the ruler of the ascendant is just, I've noticed that sometimes people, the ruler of the ascendant in the seventh, they tend to find themselves and find their own identity during one period of their life through relationships, but sometimes they have a tendency to go too far so that their own identity becomes submerged within the relationship or submerged under the needs of like the other, or subsumed under the needs of the other. But then it sounds like part of what you're having to do is redefine that now, especially outside of the relationship, and find out sort of who you are and what you want.
Exactly. As I said, it's like I said to myself, well, I must have come into this life with 2 fire signs because I must have needed the firepower. Now I understand what that is. My natural Virgo thing of I've definitely subsumed, and it was actually a survival strategy from childhood. It worked for me, and I've just continued that. As I said, it's like a power behind the throne thing. So in partnership, I help them succeed in ways they probably couldn't on their own, but I'm not I'm not in the spotlight. So that's definitely, and when you meet somebody at 16 and you're not legally divorcing them until 68, yeah, I would say that, I was definitely subsumed. But as I said, I think my fire signs in this situation have saved me. Maybe I'm just one of those seeds that's under, germinating for, whatever, 56 years. And now I'm going to bud and, bloom. And that's why I don't like chronological time, because it makes me, it's like, well, that's a heck of a long time compared to other people. But, I'm just going with it because it feels better. I was out of balance, and now I'm trying to get to use all of my astrological benefits and recognize all of my astrological possibly imbalances. It's like working with this is very empowering.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, it's incredible to have that breakthrough and yeah, to enter into that new era of your life. That seems like a gift and like a really great moment of progress and like stepping into and finding yourself.
Yes, and I definitely could have been a nurse, because I always had this feeling I would be one of the surgical nurses that would anticipate handing the doctor the instrument, like before they even knew they needed it. I always had that weird thing, it's like I would hand the scalpel even before they needed it, because again, this intuition, I can recognize patterns. It's just a thing. So so I could have gone into nursing, but I kind of did have that feeling. I didn't go into special ed teaching. I realized I didn't have the necessary boundaries. I would have gotten burnt out. I would have taken my health, I think, to to the edge. Intuitively, I said, no, that's way too much. I'll just overgive to my family, then spreading that out could have been, the death of me, really. So I thought about going that way, but something said, no, that's, like danger. And I think now I can look back and say, yeah, I would have burnt out. I didn't have the boundaries, because I'm in the Virgo. I mean, I'll help anybody. I still will, but now it's just much more balanced. I mean, part of not getting legally divorced is letting my husband stay on my health plan. I mean, I think everybody should have a health plan, but that's just kind of a charitable thing you do for people, that you've had a long relationship with. It doesn't fit into conventional a lot, but I think a lot of the unconventional is going to become conventional because it's just more charitable and kind.
Yeah,
I
that's a really
hope.
good,
I hope.
I think those are really good keywords for your chart, especially with that Mercury in Pisces. Sextile Venus is just like charitable and kind. Thanks for sharing this example. This is actually a surprisingly great example, so I'm glad you shared it.
Okay, I'm a little weirded out, but I'm very proud of myself. And I'm really happy to meet you in semi-person.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you as well. It's nice to connect, with somebody's listening to the podcast and to hear their story and to get a snapshot of their life like this. So thanks for sharing it with me.
You're welcome. And
All right.
I just want to say all the best to everyone listening.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
That was awesome. All right. So does anybody else have a good example like that? Because that was a stunning example of just like the ruler of the ascendant in a specific house and how that topic has come out up and been so important in the life, but also how sometimes, depending on different transits at different points in the life, the focus can shift in different ways, and sometimes move towards a specific topic or sometimes move away from it, but still having it sort of be dictated by the chart placements and the transits. Um, Let me glance and see if there's any more ruler of the ascendant in the house placement transits, or ruler of the ascendant in the houses placements that I missed. I'm not seeing any, and I know we're getting to the end of this, so it might be sort of final thoughts and wrap up time here. All right, so that might require a whole other episode. And like I said, I have a module on this in my Hellenistic astrology course in the ruler of the ascendant, where I go into this in much more detail. So if people want to learn more about the ruler of the ascendant, they can go there. But generally speaking, just when the ruler of the ascendant is in a specific house in the chart, there's something distinctive and important about that house that's going to define something about the native's overall life direction, but also sometimes it's going to define things about their identity, who they are, how they see themselves, sometimes things about their physicality and their physical body, because basically all of the first house significations get wrapped up in the ruler of the ascendant as well. And sometimes they get directed towards or focused on the specific area, including the sign placement, the house placement, and the aspects to the ruler of the ascendant, which are all very important. All right, so I think that's it. So this was great. Thank you, everybody, for sharing your examples and for joining me for this. This is a bit of an experiment, but I've been meaning to start this series on the houses for quite a while now. But I was having trouble figuring out how to start it with the first house, because the first house can sometimes be such an abstract house in terms of what it actually means in practice when you're talking about significations like self or you or other things like that. But I think we were able to get to some very core things here by going through these different examples and hearing different people share their stories. So thanks to everybody who submitted a story both online, and especially thanks to everybody that joined me on video here to share their life story and talk about their charts in person. I really appreciate it. So this is going to be the beginning of a series, and I'm hoping in the long term to eventually have coverage of all 12 houses. So hopefully in the long term, we'll do a whole series talking about each house and continuing to develop this kind of investigative model that we're doing here by learning what the placements and what the houses mean by talking to people who have that house prominent in their chart in some way and hearing their real life stories of what that actually means and how that works out in practice. So that's going to be a long-term series that we're going to be doing for quite a while now. And it's going to set up something that'll probably take me months, if not a year. But I think it'll be worth it if the rest of the episodes are anything like this one in terms of the types of discussions and the quality of the discussions we can have by talking to people directly in person. Then I think we're all going to learn a lot and get a lot out of it by approaching it in this sort of format and in this manner. So yeah, so thanks everyone for watching. Thanks to all the patrons that joined me today. Thanks for your support and helping me to do this work, because I think this is really valuable and really important. And I'm glad to be able to do it together with a group of people, so that it's like a community project that we're doing here, like a research project together, and we're sort of like finding things and learning things as we go. So for those watching the public version of this in the future, once I release it, if you'd like to join us for one of these live streams, you just have to become a patron of the Astrology Podcast through my page on Patreon. And if you join the live stream tier, then you'll get a notification the next time that I schedule one of these webinars. And you'll have the ability to share your chart if you have a good example and join us through this live stream format or through this webinar format. Other than that, if you want to learn more about astrology and my approach to reading birth charts, then check out my Hellenistic Astrology course, where I take people from basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts, and where I have extensive lectures going through each of the houses, going through the concepts like the ruler of the ascendant or the rulers of the houses, as well as different lectures on assessing planetary conditions, that you understand what a planet means in a chart and how it's functioning. So as we go through this series, we'll see all of that in much more detail as we go through each example and we sort of apply these principles in practice. But if you're just looking for a more worked out and sort of systemized sort of set of lessons to learn how I'm interpreting these birth charts when I do this on the fly, definitely check out that Hellenistic course at theastrologyschool.com. All right, I think that's it for this episode. So thanks everyone for watching or listening, and I'll see you again next time. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. In exchange, you'll get access to some great subscriber benefits, including early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the forecast each month, our monthly auspicious elections podcast, which is only available to patrons, a whole exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits. You can find out more information at patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Jeannie Marie Kaplan, Melissa Delano, Sunny Bozbaz, and Kwatsi Ali Barohu. If you're looking for a reliable astrologer to get an astrological consultation with, then we have a new list of astrologers on the podcast website that we recommend for readings. Most of the astrologers specialize in birth chart readings, although some also offer synastry, rectification, electional astrology, horary questions, and more. Find out more information at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of SolarFire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology, where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures, as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts, as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com.